one of the things that is common across most predatory fish is they'll eat anything that can fit in their mouths. If it's a duckling, people have found songbirds in the mouths in the guts of trout, and these are ones that probably drowned and drifted downstream. But if it can fit in their mouths, they'll eat it.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and that is Hamish Grieg. He's a bug guy, or really an aquatic insect specialist at the University of Maine. He's also a fly fisherman, and it was fly fishing that got him interested in bugs. Any fly fisherman worth his salt is keenly aware of what fish are eating and when. But you might not know the science of what's going on, and this show might teach you a trick or two. Like you can actually tell from the splash of a rising trout what it might be eating. If you're not a fly fisher, you might learn a thing or two about what's going on in your stream and what it's doing in there. For instance, leeches. Do fish eat them? Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. Now then, I've been saving this show since April, when Hamish Grieg made his annual presentation to the Penobscot Fly Fishers Workshop. Today, we're getting up close and personal with fish food.
Welcome everyone to Fly Fishing 101, and I've now been doing this for 3 years, and my role is to talk about bugs, because really aquatic insects are one of the key kind of pieces of fly fishing. I'm also I'm a professor at the University of Maine, and I study stream insects. That's my job, and so it's wonderful to be able to talk to you about insects and talk about the links between insects and fishing, because that's how I came about getting interested in the science of bugs and what they do under the water. So what I thought I'd do, we'll talk a little bit about aquatic insects, we'll talk a little bit about fish that trout and other game fish feed on, and some of the other types of aquatic prey that you might, and non-aquatic prey you might find, and how we can go about imitating them. But I just wanted to step back a little bit and start by introducing myself. Clearly I'm not from around here. Any thoughts on where I'm from?
Australia.
Ah dear. I'm from New Zealand, and it's kind of random that I'm now in Maine working on stream insects in Maine, but the way I came about becoming interested in these things is I grew up in this country which is full of amazing waterways, and in those amazing waterways are some really, really large trout. And New Zealand is really well known for its large trout, and I started fly fishing when I was 12 or 13. And the first thing that I did when I started fly fishing, my uncle took me out, we went to a local stream, and before we even started rigging together our rods or anything like that, we just waded out and he picked up a rock and turned it over, and underneath were all these insects that I never even thought were there. I had no idea there was all this diversity of life underneath the rocks of a river. And he showed me those because they were really the essence of fly fishing, is trying to imitate the insects that trout are eating, or any other species that we're trying to catch or eating. And of course, New Zealand, like many other places, including Maine, has a bunch of really, really cool insects. And as I started learning more about insects because I wanted to catch more trout, I started getting really fascinated in the insects themselves. What makes them tick? Why you find different insects in one stream to another? All those types of questions that come up when you start looking at these really fascinating and really quite beautiful creatures. And that's how I came about studying aquatic insects. And it's taken me around the world, and it's taken me to the University of Maine, and my job is to research and teach people about aquatic insects and how freshwater ecosystems in Maine work. And it's something that I love doing, and I'm really excited about being able to share that with you today. And the reason why aquatic insects are so important to fishing, but also to streams and other freshwater systems in general, is they're kind of like the machinery that drives these ecosystems, makes them work. So if you think about the base of a stream, the best trout streams are slippery to wade on. That's why you need wading boots that have felt or studs and things like that. And the reason why they're slippery is there's all this little microscopic algae that encrusts the rocks, and that algae is taking carbon dioxide and it's turning it into sugars, and that provides the food for the whole system. There's also leaves that fall into streams from the surrounding landscape, and that provides food as well. And what aquatic insects do is turn that food into their own bodies. And in the process of doing that, they move that energy through this ecological system, and then fish are able to eat those insects, and that energy that comes from the slime on the bottom of the rocks makes it all the way through and is the reason why trout are so big. All the body of a trout comes originally from algae on the bottom of the stream, or leaves on the bottom of the stream that have been turned into insects. And so that's why insects are cool, and that's why I study them, and that's why as fishes we're really interested in imitating them. So I thought I would start by talking about mayflies, let's just take a step back a bit. How many people have heard of mayflies before? All right, caddisflies? Trichoptera? All right, we're not going to use any Latin here. It doesn't matter. If any of you have seen some fly fishing books, there's one by Ernest Schwiebert called Nymphs. It's this thick. So sometimes fly fishermen get really crazy into identifying aquatic insects, learning all the Latin names, knowing which wing vein is different from the other wing vein that separates one species from another. We're not going to deal with that today. It doesn't matter for us. What we're going to talk about is the core groups of insects and how we might go about imitating them. Because for us, it's just working out a way to catch trout is the goal for all this whole thing. And I'll start with mayflies, because mayflies are really kind of archetypal, if you like, aquatic insect. They're the sort of thing that's captured fly fishermen's minds for years. And if you go back and read the early books that were written in the 1700s, 1800s, they talk about mayflies because they're just really cool animals. And they have these really big wings that stick up like sailboats, and when they're flying, when they're alighted on the surface of the water, they just look like really amazing creatures. But what we'll do is we'll go through with mayflies the life cycle of an aquatic insect, because it's kind of a generic life cycle that works for a lot of our other types of insects. And we heard earlier on when we were talking about getting flies underwater, and Ed mentioned sinking lines, how trout and other other fish spend a lot of their time feeding under the water. And that's because the life cycle of aquatic insects, the vast majority of their time is spent underwater. So pretty much what happens, we'll start with an adult that's laid some eggs. Those eggs will drift down to the bottom of the stream and they'll hatch into nymphs. These are the aquatic stages of insects. Nymphs and larvae are interchangeable as far as today goes, so I'll probably use them interchangeably. They mean the same thing, essentially. And the nymph, its whole job in life is to eat as much as it possibly can. And various insects eat different things, but what it's doing is eating food and turning it into their body and growing. And they don't have shells or exoskeletons that can grow. They have to molt them off and come out with a new one and grow into that, and then molt it off and come out with a new one. They do that 15, 20 times, some of them 30 or 40 times, doesn't really matter. But they go through these stages and get bigger and bigger and bigger underwater. And that's 80-90% of the life cycle of a whole insect is underwater, these things eating food. And then at some point they get ready to emerge as adults. And they'll crawl out to the side of the stream or swim up to the top of the water column, and they'll pull themselves out of their nymphal exoskeleton, this little sort of outer body that they have, and out comes a winged adult. And that winged adult, its whole job in life is to find another adult of the opposite sex, mate and lay eggs. And for mayflies, that only lasts for 2 days. They might spend a year or 2 years underwater as nymphs, but only a couple of days flying around our landscape trying to find a female or a male to mate with and laying eggs. So the vast majority of time it's underwater, and that's why fish most of the time eat things underwater.
So mayflies exist just long enough to have sex. For the rest of this critter's life, it's a rapidly growing nymph underwater. And for most of your fishing, that's what you're trying to imitate. Hamish Grigg is an aquatic insect biologist at the University of Maine and an avid fly fisherman. Up next, there's that glorious moment when all those nymphs are turning into mayflies and emerging from the water. You've seen it, but what's that all about? This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. In April, Penobscot fly fishers put on a day-long workshop called Fly Fishing 101. One of the best presentations every year is put on by Hamish Grigg, an aquatic insect biologist at the University of Maine. I captured that presentation, and right now we're watching a video of mayflies emerging from the water. In its nymph stage, these guys get into the sediment of lakes and slow-moving rivers like the Penobscot. They burrow in, chowing down at whatever they find in the mud. When the time comes, all these nymphs suddenly swim to the surface, emerge from their exoskeleton, their nymph shell, and break through the surface tension of the water to begin life anew as a flying insect. That only lasts a day or two, since they basically look for a mate, lay eggs, and die. Some of these hatches are incredible, like snow filling the air but falling up.
And when they do that, they alight on the surface as the adult, and they have a wing that sticks above them, and they'll sit up, they'll push their way through the surface of the film, and then fly off into the landscape around them. And this all happens quite quickly, and it happens fairly synchronously, if you like, across different individuals of a species. They'll all come out around about the same time. And so you get this amazing swarm of adults flying around looking for a mate to mate with. But mayflies are unlike any other insect. They actually have a second adult stage. And the reason why they have a second adult stage is because they have to get off the water and fly away. And getting off the water and flying away, if you've got these big long wings sticking up above you, is really hard, because if those wings get caught in the surface film of the water, they're dead and they can't get away. So they have little hairs all along their wings to help them. Those hairs repel water and help them push through and fly off from the surface of the water without getting stuck in it. But having hairs on your wings is a really crappy way to fly, because it weighs them down, it's too heavy. So they go through the second stage where they actually molt last time. There's a wing underneath the wing, and they pull themselves out of that exoskeleton and fly off without any hairs on their wings. So they're really quite amazing animals, and they go through these really cool stages, in each of which we can imitate as fly fishermen. So what I want to do now is actually go through the life stages of these mayflies and how we go about imitating them, because they're really freaking cool animals.
A single female can lay 500 to 700 eggs. Let's take a particular species of mayfly that fly fishermen like to tie, a blue-winged olive. These nymphs crawl along the surface of rocks, eating little pieces of algae. They scrape them off the rock with their little mouth parts.
And because these nymphs are feeding on the tops of rocks, they're right down at the bottom of the stream. So when we imitate nymphs, when we're fly fishing, we want our fly to sink down to the bottom of the stream where the nymphs are and where they're available to trout. So you often see trout flies that have little beads on the front, and those help the flies sink down. They also sometimes give a little sparkle that helps catch the fish's eye. And a lot of our nymphs are quite long and thin, so our flies tend to be fairly long and thin, and sometimes tied on hooks that imitate a bent body, because most things in nature aren't perfectly straight. The mayfly has 3 tails. Now there are some species, and this is one of them, so well picked, that have the middle tail that's reduced right down so you can hardly see it. And this is where you need to pull out a microscope, and it gets crazy from there. And there are lots of other types of mayfly nymphs, and these are a couple of other ones that you'll find crawling around the bottom of a stream. And this one is another species that has just a little nubbin of its 3rd tail in the middle. So it's easy for us to say, well, mayflies have 3 tails, but sometimes it's hard to see from the naked eye. This particular one is really good at sitting on really fast rocks, because it's got a flat head that helps it. It's almost like an aerofoil or a spoiler on the back of a car. It pushes it down and helps it hold itself on the surface of the rocks. So when they get to the stage where they're coming off the bottom and they're trying to break their way through the surface film, it's really hard, because of course the surface film has the whole weight of the atmosphere pushing together all the little water molecules, and so it gets the skin. And for something that's small, pushing their way through that's really hard. And it takes them 5 or 10 seconds to do so. They can't swim when they're doing that. They're just stuck there, hanging in the film like a comma on a page. And that's where they're really vulnerable to trout. And often we talk as fishermen about emergers and fishing the emergers. That's these nymphs that are trying to pull their way through that water surface. And the flies that we fish for emergers hang underneath the surface film, like these ones here. They have some form of flotation or a hackle, which is pulled off the back of a rooster's neck and has all these little barbs sticking out. And that helps the fly just sit on the surface film. And you can see the sort of shape and orientation of the fly looks a lot like the natural nymph. But if you're not catching trout on flies that are floating high above the surface, but you're still seeing them rise, then that's when I'd throw in an emerger, because they're probably feeding just underneath, and it looks like they're feeding on top.
I'm sure fly fishermen have seen this many times. A trout is breaking the surface of the water, but is not leaping out to catch something in the air. All you see is the little circles of water disturbed by the dorsal fin of the trout. Once again, that's the time that trout are probably catching these emergers, when they're trying to break through the surface tension of the water.
And then you get to the next stage, the adult stage, which is when they've pulled themselves out. And these hatches happen all at once. Often the same individuals of the same species hatch all at the same time. And so you'll get the surface of the water looking something like this. And that's when you get really exciting times, because you can see all the fish up and rising. But the whole idea of a mayfly hatch is kind of just, it's something that captures the minds of fishermen, and it's a really exciting thing. And so there's all types of different mayflies we could throw Latin around all over the place, but the main thing is, if you see a hatch happening, to have a look at the mayfly on the surface of the water and pick a fly that's about the same colour and about the same size. That's all you need to do. You don't need to know if it's a blue-winged olive or a Baetis bicaudatus, it doesn't matter. Common ones are blue-winged olives. They hatch all through the season. They're kind of popcorn for trout. They're there all the time. Other famous things like Pool Gordons have smoky wings. There's one called the pale morning dun, which has this really amazing yellow body and yellow wings. They look really cool. But again, you're just matching the fly size and colour to what you're seeing around you. And the other thing you'll see, especially when you look at when you talk about fly tying in the other sessions, is there are various ways you can design a fly to imitate an adult mayfly. And the fly you use sometimes matches the type of water you're fishing. So something that's tied in a really sparse way like this is probably not going to float very well in a really bouldery, fast river, because it'll get swamped by waves and things and it'll sink. So if the river's really fast, often people fish patterns that have some flotation in them, some foam, or in the case of this is deer hair off the hide of a deer, and it's hollow. And if you spin that around the hook shank, you actually create this thing that floats kind of like a cork. And they're great for big bolstery water. And if you're fishing places where the fish have a lot of time to inspect the fly, really slow-moving streams when they can come up and look at the fly before they take it, you want something that looks a bit more like a natural insect. So then you go with these kind of more sparse-bodied things. This is kind of a traditional dry fly. It has a hackle made out of rooster feathers, and there's a couple of wings sticking up and a tail that sticks out, and it sits just on the top of the water and floats downstream, and that imitates mayflies.
You're listening to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Today's presentation was captured at the Penobscot Fly Fishers Workshop in April. Hamish Grieg is an aquatic insect specialist at the University of Maine, and he's a fly fisherman. While most fly fishermen can see what the mayflies are doing, Hamish knows why they're doing it. We've been talking a lot about nymphs. Up next, let's talk about adult mayflies. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8. We're talking fly fishing today, or more importantly, we're talking about the actual flies we're trying to imitate. So even if you don't fish, what's going on down there in the water is actually pretty interesting. Hamish Grieg is presenting at Fly Fishing 101, a day-long workshop put on by the Penobscot Fly Fishers back in April. So far, we've covered baby mayflies, adult mayflies, mayfly sex, and now it's time to discuss dead mayflies.
And then the final stage of aquatic insects, and especially mayflies, is what we call the spent stage. So they've gone out, they've emerged from the water, they've flown away, they've molted into their adult stage, they've mated, they come down and lay eggs. And then they die. And they sit on the surface film of the water, floating downstream, moving their wings a little bit in sort of the final death throes. And so patterns we fish for spent spinners, which are what we call these dead mayflies, often have wings that come straight out from the side, and they have material that's kind of sparkly that imitates the light as it moves through the clear wing of a dead insect. And at this point, they're freely available to trout because they're dead, they can't get away, and they sometimes feed on them quite intensely. And someone asked this before, when do you know what of these stages to fish? Because if a trout's feeding on the surface, it could be feeding on an emerger, it could be feeding on the first of the adult stages, or it could be feeding on the dead one at the end after it's laid its eggs. And how do you know which one to imitate? Well, it's a bit of trial and error, and it's a bit of looking at the rise form, which is the disturbance the trout makes when it comes to the surface. So this is what you love to see when you come to a stream or a lake. You love to see the disturbance of a trout as it's taking an insect off the top. And that's because, in many cases, it's breaking the surface film with its nose. And if you see a little bubble in this ring, and of course, you know, your eyesight's got to be good enough to see that, and this is all great in theory, but just run with me for a bit. If you see a little bubbles around at the center of these rings of water as they're moving out, that suggests that the trout's actually taken its nose out of the water and captured a little bit of air, and the bubble forms when its nose kind of comes out of the water and traps some air, and it comes out the side of its gills. And so that's an indication that maybe they're feeding on a dun, on the stage that's actually sitting on top of the surface. Whereas if you don't see anything and you just see a little disturbance, it's likely that the trout is feeding on something that's hanging in the film of the water surface, and so that time you choose an emerger. There's two other types of rises you sometimes see. Really vigorous, splashy rises tend to happen when the fish is pursuing something that might fly away. There's some urgency to its activities, it's feeding, and so you see quite a splashy rise. And that suggests you're feeding on the stages that are about to fly off. Or a fast-moving insect, and when we talk about caddis later on, they're a fast-moving insect that skate around the top of the stream and they splash. And then sometimes they're not actually feeding on the surface, and this can get infuriating, right? You're fishing to these feeding fish, you can see the disturbance on the top. You've tried emergers, you've tried spent spinners, you've tried normal mayfly adults, nothing's working. It could be because they're feeding just underneath, and it's not actually their nose that's coming out, it's their back that comes out of the water as they're turning down to take a nymph. And so it's a bit of trial and error. If something's not working, try something else. And a nymph just underneath the surface film, a light nymph that doesn't have any weight or lead or beads on it, can sometimes do the trick.
Hamish Grigg is doing the talking. He's a University of Maine aquatic insect biologist. The biology of any critter is often quite complicated, and getting to know trout food better may help you to fish better. Now, we've been talking a lot about mayflies, but that's not all that's lurking just under the surface.
So there's a whole bunch of things that are not mayflies, and they often get a bad rap because they're they're not as historically important for fishermen. But stoneflies, I think, are one of the coolest types of insects. These are big, burly brutes, and there's some over here in the tray, and afterwards we can have a look at them. And imitations for stoneflies are often quite a lot larger than mayfly imitations because the insects are larger. And stoneflies only have two tails, and they tend to not have gills along the lower part of their body, along their abdomen. It tends to be quite slender. And stoneflies are most of them are predators. They're kind of the brutes or the bullies of the aquatic insect world. And they're really, really cool colours. If you get them under a microscope and look at them, they're really quite amazing little insects. The ones that are in Maine that you find in almost any stream you'll ever come to, even streams flowing through the middle of Bangor, the Duchesne has these stoneflies, are the golden stones and the yellow sallies. These are common brown stoneflies. As adults, they have a lot of yellow in their bodies, and they're pretty big. We're talking this sort of size here, an inch or two long in some cases. And because they're those stoneflies, they're very much feeding under and around the rocks. So most stonefly nymphs have very heavy weight to them, so they're bumbling along or bustling along the bottom of the stream. And the adults have these wings that are folded over the back. Instead of mayflies, which are sticking up like a sail, these fold their wings over the back. And so some of the the dry flies that you'll see in that box as they're coming around have a wing that kind of imitates that wing that's folded over the back. And one of the really cool stoneflies, and if you've ever been out west, you might have heard about the salmon flies. These are something called, this is the one Latin name I'll talk about. It's called Pteronassus, which is kind of a cool name, but that's because they're these really massive things. And they only feed on leaves. They're giant things walking around the bottom of the stream, but they just eat leaves. And they get that big just by eating dead leaves, which is amazing. And then they hatch all at the same time, and so often in the mountains of the west, like Colorado or Montana, when the salmon fly hatch starts, everyone gets excited because they can catch fish on flies, dry flies that are literally this big. They're enormous, and so it's a lot of fun, and it brings even the largest trout up to the surface. And the other type of really common stream insect are caddisflies, and these are really cool because they actually have silk glands, and they're kind of a lot like aquatic moths, if you like. And so they can excrete silk out of their mouths and build cases. So they look like little grubs. Some of them are in cases, some of them are not. The adults look like moths, but instead of having scales on their wings, if you squish a moth, sometimes you get this little light dust on your fingers. Those are the scales of the wings of the moth. Caddisflies have hairs on their wings, and that helps them escape the water surface, just like the mayfly hairs do. And caddisflies build a bunch of really cool types of cases. Some of them glue pieces of rock together. Some of them secrete the case out of silk, which is what these horn case caddis have. And some of them glue together pieces of stick or twig, or hollow stems of rushes or twigs. And they tow that around with them their whole lives as larvae. They'll tow that case around, and it gives them protection from predators, and it helps them keep their position in the flow with the heavy cases. And a lot of our trout patterns of caddisflies imitate these cases in some sort of way. There are also caddisflies that don't build cases, and some of these actually build nets. They're really cool creatures that they glue together pieces of stick, and almost like a goalpost, like a soccer goalpost, and they stick those on the tops of rocks, and they string a net of silk across them, again like the net of a soccer net. And that actually, because it's on top of the rock, it captures organisms and material that's drifting in the water. So they're kind of fishing for small particles, and then they go out every few hours and clean off their net and eat the things that are stuck in it. These things, because they feed on things drifting down, you find them in streams that drain out from lakes quite often, because the zooplankton, the little microscopic crustaceans that you find in lakes, get swept out and down the river, and you often find them sitting in those types of rivers. There's also other ones that are predatory caddisflies that crawl around on the tops of rocks, and they are often green or white in colour and don't have cases, and the patterns that we fish for those often have really pronounced segmentation in the body to mimic the segmentation that you see in the larvae. So there's a whole range of different caddisfly nymphs that you could fish. And caddisflies, they're very closely related to moths and butterflies, and so they actually pupate before they emerge as an adult. They'll spin a little cocoon, and then they actually, all their body kind of rearranges itself from larval forms into the adult forms. And what comes out of this little cocoon is something we call a pupa, and it's like this weird alien mix of half adult, half larvae. And they swim from the bottom of the stream up to the top in a really kind of jerky swimming motion. They're trying to get there as fast as they possibly can. And that's a time when they're really vulnerable to trout. And often people talk about fishing caddisfly pupa, which are imitations that kind of have these same kind of features, like often little wing buds, long antennae, which is what these things here are, that imitate this pupa. And often, instead of drifting that down in the current, which we call a dead drift, where you're just letting it be swept along passively by the current, people often actually strip and swim that fly through the water. Or if you're holding your rod and you're working your line down the current, at the end of your little drift, as it gets to the end of the current, you give it a little lift, and that movement of the fly up through the water imitates the movement of a pupa as it's swimming up to the surface film to emerge. Not surprisingly, caddisfly adults look like moths, but they have a range of different colours and different shapes. And of course, the flies that we fish for caddisflies have a range of different colours and different shapes. And the key thing is just to match the fly to the insect you're seeing around in the water at the time. And you'll see that they have wings that are held almost like a tent over the back of the body, just like the insects do. And this one is made out of deer hair. So it floats really, really well in fast-moving streams, and that's one of my favourites. It's called a Goddard sedge or a deer hair sedge. And the elk hair caddis is something you'll see in every single fly shop around the world, quite literally. They're one of the most famous caddisfly patterns, and they work for anything. If you're in doubt, tie on an elk hair caddis. They're a wonderful flies.
Today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine was captured in April when the Penobscot fly fishers put on a day-long clinic called Fly Fishing 101. Hamish Grieg is an aquatic insect biologist at the University of Maine, and he's a fly fisherman. Coming up, we've covered mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. But that's not all that's on a trout's buffet table. Personally, I'm rooting for them to eat as many black flies as possible. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Even if you're not a fly fisherman, even if you're just curious about nature, today's show is for you. We're actually taking a look at those weird critters in the water besides fish. In fact, they're fish food. So far, we've covered all the flies that emerge from streams, feeding trout and thrilling anglers. But what about the lakes and ponds? Hamish Grieg is the aquatic bug guy at the University of Maine.
I'm sure a lot of you are interested in fishing for trout or bass or anything like that in lakes and ponds. And there's a few things you find in lakes and ponds that you don't often find in streams, and they're actually quite important for that diet of fish. And one of them is these really cool creatures called bloodworms, or midges. Now these are some of the hardiest aquatic insects you'll ever find. You'll find them in sewage outfalls, you'll find them in holding ponds, you'll find them in tiny little pools in the bottom of forests or in the holes of trees in the forest. They're really amazing creatures. And they're bright red because they live in places that have very little oxygen. And what makes them bright red is the same thing that makes our blood red. It's hemoglobin. It's a cell within the body, or material within the blood that helps hold oxygen. So they're bright red because they're really good at living in places with no oxygen, like the scungiest, crappiest things. And they have a pupal stage just like caddisflies do that swim up through the surface. But that's one of the sort of best types of patterns. Chironomids or midges are some of the most useful patterns for fishing lakes, especially this time of the year. A couple of other things you find in both lakes and streams are hellgrammites or Dobson flies. They're really, really cool animals. They have these big gills sticking off the side. They look just bizarre, and giant mandibles. They're predatory and really massive. And this is actually a trout that I caught in a really fast-moving stream, and this is one that we kept to eat, and it had about 30 of these in its gut. And these are all about this big, so he was having a good day. So Dobson flies and the flies people fish for Dobson flies try to imitate the gills and the legs, but really it doesn't matter. Something big and heavy that's about the same size will do. And I'm sure if you've ever walked to the side of a lake and you've looked in and you've seen insects darting around, you may well have seen water boatmen or back swimmers. These are actually more related to aphids than they are to mayflies. They're a true bug. And they have legs that act like oars, and they beat them through the water like this to move through. Back swimmers do it on their backs, water boatmen do it on their fronts. And they actually come up to the surface and suck in oxygen from the surface film of the water and hold it underneath their wings. And they often have a nice shiny look under the water because that's the air trapped underneath their wings. And so a lot of patterns to imitate water boatmen and back swimmers have some form of shiny material, be it peacock herl or some other silver material to try and imitate that shine. But the main thing for them is how you would move them through the water. They move in a jerky motion, so you want to be stripping your fly line like this and moving the fly in a jerky sort of way through the water. And the last insect I'm going to talk about are the dragonflies. And of all the aquatic insects, these are the ones that people see the most, but in the adult form, and there's some really cool adults in that case over there. Dragonflies are really good, really cool predators. They walk around on the bottom of lakes, and they actually have this modified mouth part they hold underneath their head. And it's their lower lip that's actually modified into a grasping feature. And so they hold them under their heads, and they're walking around, they find prey, and they grab it and pull it in, and that's this bizarre bottom lip that does that. They're really cool animals. And because, dragonflies are found, and here are some imitations of dragonflies and damselflies. Because they're found on the bottom of lakes, people fish them deep, often with a sinking line. They often have quite a bit of weight to them. Dragonflies are bulky. Their abdomens are usually fatter than their heads. And damselflies are long and thin and dainty. That's why they're called damselflies, I guess. But very closely related to each other. The damselflies move by wiggling their butts, and you'll see them in that tray over there. As they swim around, they wiggle their butts. And so often patterns have long, soft material. When you pull it through the water, it wiggles like this, and that attracts fish. The adults, we've all seen adult dragonflies and damselflies flying around. These are the ones that actually do last a long time. They can live up to a year or so as they're flying around the landscape. And they're really good predators of flies and other things like that. They can take them on the wing. Trout often don't eat damselflies and dragonflies as adults because they're really fast. It's hard for them to catch.
Okay, pop quiz. And I expect all fly fishermen to know this one. Do fish eat leeches? Yeah, they love leeches. They're a good source of protein. And there are fly tying patterns that imitate leeches. Actually, fish, ducks, turtles all eat leeches, and leeches will eat them. It's possible to find leeches attached to critters that would eat them if they got the chance. There are some leeches that will suck the blood out of another leech that just sucked the blood of something else. You can't make this stuff up.
So there are also a bunch of things that aren't insects that are kind of important sometimes for trout, especially, maybe not so much bass, but certainly trout. And that are little crustaceans. So a lot of big lakes that have, like reservoirs that have a dam, and then water coming from the bottom of that dam feeding what we call tailwaters or outlet streams, often have these things called mysid shrimp, which are almost transparent little shrimp. They're kind of like what you see off the coast that whales eat. And they can be really important for the diet of trout. And other things you see in some in the trays are little scuds, little, we call them amphipods. They're crustaceans that swim around the bottom of the stream, and they're kind of closely related to leafhoppers. If you were to move some leaves away from your lawn and things are hopping away, it's the aquatic version of those. There's also aquatic pillbugs or sow-bugs that trout can eat sometimes as well. And I think as a fly tyer, and I've been fly tying as long as I've been fishing for trout and other fish, streamers are where you kind of really, they capture the hearts of fly tyers, because trout flies, for imitating other fish, are often really colourful and really, really fun to tie. And these are imitating fish, and of course for a predator, eating a fish is a lot better in terms of food gained than eating a tiny little bug. So when fish are around and available, then trout tend to eat them, and bass certainly tend to eat them. And streamers often imitate the type of fish that's around at the time. For example, this is a famous streamer, the black-nosed dace, one of the classics of historical streamer fishing in this area. And this is a black-nosed dace, and you can see the colours sort of match the colours on the side of the fish. A lot of our big lakes, if you ever go trolling for salmon, smelt are one of the main things that landlocked salmon eat. And a lot of our smelt patterns have the sort of iridescent materials and colours that this side of the smelt have on them. There are also other fish that kind of skulk around on the bottom of the stream. So sculpins, really big mouths, big fat heads, ugly little brutes. They skulk around on the bottom of the streams and among weed beds and things. And if you're fishing for fish that might be feeding on sculpins, the patterns are often really bulky flies. These are sort of, the extremes, these articulated body streamers that have these giant heads and long rubber legs and look like something out of a horror movie. And then, if you're learning how to fly fish in Maine, and as sort of an outsider that's come to Maine and lives in Orno, smallmouth bass are one of the most fun things to catch that I've ever come across. They're amazing little fish, and they're super strong, and they feed on anything that can fit in their mouths, and they have gigantic mouths. And so a lot of bass flies are really big things that attract the attention of these really large predators. So flies that imitate frogs, flies that imitate frog tadpoles, like bullfrog tadpoles, and other bait fish and things like that. There are also other flies that sit on the surface of the water called poppers, and you cast them out and they float on the surface of the water, and when you give them a pull, when you retrieve, they'll make a popping noise and a splash, and that disturbance attracts predatory fish like bass. And it's an awful lot of fun to see these giant fish with big ass mouths coming up and grabbing a popper as it's going through the surface. And of course, not all trout food is aquatic. A lot of things fall into rivers and lakes by accident. And so things like grasshoppers and things like beetles and cicadas and other terrestrial insects that are flying around the landscape sometimes fall in. And especially during midsummer when those are active, trout can key in on them and feed on them. Ants are another thing that trout sometimes feed on.
And that's still not the weirdest thing you'll find inside the belly of a trout or bass or any predatory fish. Today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine was captured at the annual fly fishing clinic at the Penobscot Fly Fishers in April. Hamish Grieg is the aquatic insect specialist at the University of Maine, and he fly fishes, which is what actually got him hooked on bugs back when he was a little kid. Weird things fish eat, and more ways to fool a fish, coming up on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. On today's episode, we're connecting the dots. Fly fishermen are familiar with many of the aquatic insects and critters that fish like to eat because they own a bunch of flies designed to mimic those insects and critters. And as every angler knows, some of those flies are supposed to be on the surface of the water, some are designed to sink a little bit, some are supposed to go right to the bottom. Hamish Grieg is an aquatic insect biologist teaching at the University of Maine. Often when he's not teaching, he's got a fly rod in his hands. Hamish learned to love fish and bugs as a kid growing up in New Zealand. There is a breed of mouse there that sometimes undergoes a population explosion and a mating frenzy. As mice rapidly try to expand their ranges, many will try to swim across lakes and streams. And many of those end up as trout food. It's not uncommon for trout to have a belly full of mice when this happens. And those well-fed fish grow big fast. Turns out, fish will eat a lot of weird things.
But yeah, and I think that one of the things that is common across most predatory fish is they'll eat anything that can fit in their mouths. If it's a duckling, people have found songbirds in the mouths in the guts of trout, and these are ones that probably drowned and drifted downstream. But if it can fit in their mouths, they'll eat it. And so, the whole science of what bugs trout are eating often doesn't actually matter that much, because if it's in front of them and it doesn't take a lot to get, they'll eat it. And finally, not all, of course, flies that we fish are actually trying to imitate a particular insect or a particular animal. Some of them are just attractors, and they kind of trigger a predatory instinct. be it or some curiosity in fish. For example, the traditional Atlantic salmon flies, these really amazing artistic flies, are attractors. They're big flashy things that attract fish that aren't actually feeding when they get into fresh water. Salmon that are sea run don't feed when they're in fresh water. But a lot of these colours trigger memories of past feeding. For example, a lot of krill that salmon feed off on the coast of Greenland are orange in colour, or bright colours, and so the idea is sometimes these bright colours can trigger that. And then there's flies that people fish for steelhead out west, and they're pretty much cat toys rather than flies, and here's an example of one of those. I mean, it's this giant pink and white thing, and they just imitate life itself. There's nothing really that they're queuing in on. It's just something wiggly, just like some of the best lures that you see in shops, just imitating life itself.
We've been talking about what fish eat and how fish eat. As Hamish Grieg begins wrapping up the presentation, there is one more way to become a better angler. You've got to think like a fish. Because it's hard on the ego when you're outsmarted by a critter that has a brain the size of a BB.
One thing to think about when you're fishing is what a fish needs and where and how that might give you some clues to where you might find fish within a river. If you walk up to the edge of a stream, you might want to think about where you're casting in order to focus your attention on places where there are fish. And there are an inordinate number of places where there are trout or other game fish within waterways. But just think about three things. Are they going to be able to get food where they are? Are they going to be able to have some security from those bird predators you talked about before and other types of predators? And are they going to get a rest from the current? Because feeding is all about energy in being greater than energy out, energy lost through swimming in the water. And so you tend to find fish that are predatory, that are feeding off things drifting down the current in places where there's some obstruction to that current. So in front of or behind boulders, around jutting out pieces of banks where they're getting some respite from the flow and they're getting a steady supply of insects and other creatures drifting past them. Often underneath deadfall and things like that. For example, brook trout streams, anytime you come across an old beaver dam or some deadfall or other log type material or wood, you'll often find brook trout sitting underneath those because it's protection and it's also usually a place where the flow is interrupted and they can find some places to feed where they're not constantly battling against fast water. So just keep that in mind as you're fishing, is where are some of the places where they might have food without having to fight the current. So when you see a fish or when you see a fish rising, just stop and think. Have I seen insects drifting by me in the stream? Have I seen insects on the surface of the water? Is there likely to be a hatch on or not? Is it early in the season when some of these mayflies haven't gone through their development and they're not hatching yet, so they're likely to be under the water? Or is it late in the summer where you might have things like grasshoppers and stuff falling in? Just go through your mind and think, okay, what might this fish be feeding on? And then once you've decided that, select a fly and present it to the best of your ability. And if it doesn't work the first few times, change and try something else. And of course, a fly only catches a fish if it's in the water, so somebody that's changing flies 15 times every 15 minutes is probably not going to catch much. But you might find yourself in a situation like this. You tie on a fly and you cast. You can see the fish moving back and forth now. It comes across, you see its mouth open, takes your fly, and there you are.
We're eavesdropping on a program put on by University of Maine biologist Hamish Grieg at the Penobscot Fly Fishers Workshop back in April. He has shown some video, he's passed around some flies, he's shown some pictures, none of which you've been able to see. So where can you get information on all this stuff?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of places where you can find information on what type of insects are around and what might be hatching. And most fly fishing shops that are near a river will have some information on their website, or if you go in and talk to them, some information about what insects might be hatching when. So for example, early season, some of the crawling mayflies hatch, and then later on you might get another type of mayfly that hatches. So one of the great things you can do when you're fishing is talk to local fly shops or look on the websites of local fly shops, and they'll often have a fishing report which is telling you what sort of insects are around and what flies you might want to use for those insects. And that's one of your best resources. There are a bunch of places where you can find images of pictures of insects and other cool aquatic life. These ones here is where most of my insect pictures come from for class or for this presentation. There's a nice hatch chart on mainflyfishing.com. And again, outfitters and stores will have a good indication. And you walk into somewhere like Al Albeen or Van Rieman's and you'll just see just these most amazing arrays of flies that you can purchase. Just ask someone, I want to go to Grand Lake Stream and catch some landlocked salmon. What should I be fishing with this time of year? And they'll have some good ideas for you.
That's Hamish Grieg, University of Maine professor, aquatic insect biologist, fly fisherman. The program was presented at Fly Fishing 101, put on by the Penobscot Fly Fishers in April. Now, they're a sociable group who love fishing, advocate for conservation, and do everything they can to introduce fly fishing to new anglers, young and old. The website is naturally PenobscotFlyFishers.com. They take the summer off to go fishing, but they have fly tying classes in winter, a day-long workshop in the spring, and a series of lectures throughout the year. And I should know because I'll be giving one of those talks in September. It's PenobscotFlyFishers.com. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine airs every Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. Plus, this show and all previous shows are archived online at 929theticket.com. Brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket.